What leads a child to commit such a terrible act? That question echoed in the minds of everyone in the city as news of the trial of a 10-year-old boy spread like wildfire. Accused of taking the life of his newborn sister, little Lucas became the center of a storm of indignation and hasty judgments. The courtroom was filled with judgmental looks, and the weight of the condemnation already seemed to weigh on his frail shoulders. The judge, known for his coldness, did not hesitate to sentence the boy to 9 years in a correctional institution. However, something didn't feel right. The facts didn't fit, and the truth seemed to be hidden under layers of secrecy and manipulation. Lucas grew up in a hostile environment where justice was a word whispered with fear, and love was often lost in the shadows of the past. He dreamed of being free in a world where children could play without fear, but now his future was threatened. The dream of freedom became a distant echo, suffocated by the brutal reality that surrounded it. His life had become a constant struggle against injustice, and the weight of guilt, even if it was not his, followed him like a shadow. Meanwhile, the judge, named Eduardo, began to question the speed with which the case had been decided. He knew his reputation was at stake, but there was something deeper that bothered him. Lucas's desperate look, the fragility of his childhood, made Eduardo reflect on his own choices and the consequences they brought. He remembered his own childhood, where the pressure to do what was right had shaped him, but it had also alienated him from the people he loved. Interactions with his courtroom colleagues, who saw Lucas only as a criminal, made him uneasy. He felt that there was more to this story than meets the eye. Sleepless nights became frequent for Eduardo as he reviewed the evidence. He realized that the truth was like a puzzle where some pieces were missing. The families involved had secrets buried, and manipulation seemed to be present around every corner. Eduardo found himself at a crossroads. Should he continue to take the easy path, the one that would keep him in his position of power, or risk digging up something that could cost him his career and his life? The urgency to uncover the truth was increasing, and he knew he needed to act quickly. While Eduardo delved deeper into the investigation, Lucas faced his own demons. The loneliness of the correctional institution became an unbearable burden, and he wondered if anyone, somewhere, believed in his innocence. The boy dreamed of the day when he could laugh and play again, away from the stern gaze of the adults who condemned him. He didn't understand why his life had changed so drastically, but a voice inside him whispered that the truth was hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered. Tension was rising, and Eduardo knew that time was running out. He remembered an old friend, a journalist, who had always been curious and willing to investigate what others preferred to ignore. With this idea in mind, he decided to seek help, aware that Lucas's fate and his own reputation were intertwined. The weight of responsibility accompanied him, but there was a spark of hope in his heart. The search for the truth was just beginning, and Edward was determined to illuminate the shadows surrounding this tragic case. Now he needed to find out if there was really a light at the end of the tunnel, or if it was all just an illusion. The search for the truth became an increasingly heavy burden for Eduardo. In court, the conversations between colleagues were dry and hurried, as if Lucas's case was just another one to be filed. He watched the way they spoke of the boy as if he were not a child, but a monster. This bothered him deeply. Lucas's blank and lost gaze, which seemed so far away, haunted him. Eduardo knew he had to act, and fast. The decision to look for the journalist, Paolo, lit a flame of hope that he had not felt for a long time. Paul was a man of principle, always willing to investigate the truth, even if it brought him into conflict with the authorities. Eduardo had met Paolo in law school, and their friendship grew stronger over the years, despite the different choices each made. While Eduardo had become a judge, Paulo had become an investigative reporter, always looking for stories that exposed injustices and corruption. Eduardo called him, and the conversation was quick but intense. He explained Lucas's situation, and the journalist immediately promised to help. The first meeting between the two took place in a small, cozy cafe away from the court's critical eye. Eduardo sat at the table, nervous, stirring his spoon in the coffee as Paulo arrived. As soon as his friend entered, Eduardo noticed the determination in Paulo's eyes. "Are you sure you want to do that?" asked Paulo, taking a sip of coffee. "The pressure will be immense." "Yes, I know," replied Eduardo, his voice trembling a little. "But something is not right. Luke cannot be blamed. We need to find out the truth." Paul nodded, understanding the urgency of the situation. Together they discussed the evidence, the witnesses, and the inconsistencies in the case. With each new piece of information that emerged, the certainty that something deeper was happening increased. Meanwhile, Lucas faced his own maze of emotions. In the institution, the children were constantly reminded of their mistakes, and the words of contempt and anger echoed in their ears. He would sit in a corner of the courtyard, watching the other boys play and laugh. What he wanted most was to be part of those laughs, but the weight of the accusation isolated him. He remembered the nights when his sister slept next to him, warming his heart, and now that memory became an unbearable burden. On one of the darkest nights, Lucas lay on the bed in his small room, staring at the ceiling. The walls seemed to close in on him, and he couldn't stop the tears from streaming down his face. "Why did this happen to me?" he whispered, as if the universe could answer him. He felt trapped, not knowing how to escape from that cruel reality. Fear of the future consumed him, and he wondered if anyone would ever believe in his innocence. At the institution, there was a boy named Felipe who was also considered problematic. Felipe had a rebellious manner, but a deep understanding of the injustices of the world. As he sat next to Lucas, he noticed the sadness in the boy's eyes. "Hey, what's going on?" asked Felipe with a tone of genuine concern. Lucas hesitated, but decided to open his heart. "They think I killed my sister. I didn't, but no one believes me." Felipe, who had already faced his own battles, looked at Lucas with empathy. "Sometimes people don't see the truth. They prefer to believe the easy lies." Lucas felt a little comfort in Felipe's words. "But what if I end up here forever? What if no one discovers the truth?" "You have to fight. You can't give up. If you don't believe in yourself, who will?" replied Felipe, with the determination of someone who had already lost a lot. The conversation planted a seed of hope in Lucas's heart, but also a hint of doubt. He wanted to believe that he could fight, but the chains of guilt and fear bound him. As Edward and Paul continued their investigation, they began to ask difficult questions. They discovered that Lucas's family had a complicated history, full of secrets that involved abuse and neglect. Eduardo felt a lump in his throat when he realized that much of what happened in Lucas's life was the result of a cycle of pain that was perpetuating. He began to wonder if he himself was being part of this cycle, just following the rules and ignoring the injustices that were before his eyes. Conversations with Paulo became more frequent, and Eduardo felt the pressure increasing. With each new piece of evidence, he was forced to confront his own beliefs about justice and morality. He began to realize that in order to fight for the truth, he would have to challenge not only his peers, but also his own convictions. The fear of losing her position and the stability it brought weighed heavily on her mind. Doubt accompanied him at every step, and he wondered if he was prepared to face what was to come. The interactions between them and the revelations that emerged brought out intense emotions. Eduardo felt torn between the desire to do what was right and the fear of the consequences it could bring. Sleepless nights became a constant in his life, and he found himself in a state of deep reflection. The search for truth wasn't just about Luke. It was also about his own humanity and what it meant to be a judge in a world so rife with injustice. What began as a simple affair became an internal battle for Edward, who now found himself on a moral battlefield. He knew he needed to act, but every decision seemed fraught with consequences. Voices of support and criticism echoed in his mind, and he wondered if he would ever be able to find the truth he had been seeking, not only for Lucas, but also for himself. The search for the truth began to turn into an unsustainable obsession for Eduardo. Each new day in court brought the weight of the decisions he was about to face, and the atmosphere around him became more and more oppressive. He felt like a castaway in a sea of indifference. The words about Luke echoed in his mind like a mantra of despair. He couldn't ignore the boy's lost look, and it tormented him. Conversations with Paul became a refuge, but also a source of anguish. As Edward exposed the inconsistencies of the case, Paul listened attentively, but frustration grew in both as the evidence piled up, with no one seeming willing to listen to them. "It's like we're screaming into a void," Paolo said, slapping his hand on the breakfast table. "People would rather ignore the truth than face it." Eduardo agreed, but the pressure to go with the flow of the system weighed on him. He began to feel that his position as a judge made him part of the problem. With each passing day, the doubt became more intense. He wondered if he was just doing his duty or if he was really serving justice. What was justice, after all? He wondered if he could be an instrument of change in such a broken system. Meanwhile, Luke was battling his own demons. Felipe's presence in his life brought a new kind of hope, but also a new layer of confusion. Felipe had a way of looking at life that challenged everything Lucas believed in. "Life isn't fair, but you can choose how to react to it," Philip said, his words resonating in Lucas's mind. The boy knew Felipe was right, but it was hard to see a way forward. In a moment of vulnerability, Lucas invited Felipe to share his most cherished memories. "I used to play with my sister in the park. I remember her laughter, the way she brightened my day," said Lucas, his voice breaking. Philip listened, his own eyes becoming a mirror of the pain Lucas felt. In that instant, their friendship strengthened, but it also brought to light the reality that Lucas was trapped in a cycle of pain that seemed never-ending. In court, the pressure was increasing. Eduardo began to receive subtle threats from colleagues who did not want him to get involved in Lucas's case. "You know how things work. Don't want to put yourself in a delicate position," said one of the lawyers, with a smile that did not reach the eyes. Eduardo felt the sweat running down the back of his neck. He was being watched, and the feeling of being trapped intensified. With each passing day, he became more isolated. The courtroom, which was once a place of work, now turned into a battlefield where he fought against his own colleagues and against the very institution that was supposed to protect justice. The pressure was increasing, and he began to lose sleep. The sleepless nights were filled with images of Lucas, his sister, and the emptiness in the boy's eyes. These visions made him question whether he was really doing what was right. Eduardo decided that he could not continue like this. He needed an answer, and it led him to a shocking discovery. During one of their investigations with Paul, they met a witness who had seen something on the day of the tragedy. It was an elderly woman who lived nearby and who, out of fear, never came forward. When they finally found her, she hesitated to speak, but Edward and Paul's determination caused her to open up. "I saw everything. I saw the girl run, and then I heard screams," she said, her voice trembling. "But I didn't know what to do." The revelation was a blow to Eduardo. He knew it could turn the tide of the case and potentially save Lucas. But at the same time, he felt the weight of responsibility. What if it failed again? What if this new evidence wasn't enough to change people's perceptions? The fear of failure consumed him, and he wondered if he was prepared to face the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Lucas and Felipe continued to support each other. Their friendship became a strength, but also an emotional battleground. Philip was determined to help Lucas find the courage to fight for his truth. "You can't let others define who you are," he said. But Lucas felt caught in a web of despair. He wanted to believe that he could fight, but doubt always hit him. On a particularly difficult night, Lucas had a nightmare in which he found himself trapped in a dark room, surrounded by unknown faces accusing him. He woke up in a panic, his heart racing. Felipe, who was next to him, noticed the commotion. "Hey, it's okay, you're safe here," he said, trying to calm his friend. But Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the world around him was falling apart. Eduardo, in turn, felt conflicted. With each step he took toward the truth, he wondered if he was willing to sacrifice his career for it. The voices of his classmates echoed in his mind, and he fought the temptation to give up. The pressure mounted, and the line between ethics and professional survival became increasingly blurred. Eduardo's struggle to find the truth became an internal battle, as Lucas struggled to find himself in the midst of chaos. Both faced their fears, disillusionments, and the inevitable responsibility that came with seeking justice. As the tension mounted, they knew that the only way to escape their own labyrinths would be to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. Their journey was just beginning, and the final destination was still uncertain. The discovery of the elderly woman was a watershed in Eduardo's life. The weight of his words reverberated in his heart and mind, as if each syllable was an echo of his own doubt. He recalled how helpless he had felt in the face of Lucas's case, sinking into a sea of uncertainty and fear. Now, in the face of that new evidence, a spark of hope was ignited, but that same hope also brought with it a whirlwind of emotions. Eduardo spent the nights awake, revisiting the conversation with the witness over and over again in his mind. He felt like an artist about to unveil a masterpiece, but he feared the public's reaction. The truth he sought so much was within his grasp, but the thought of standing up to his colleagues and the entire system that seemed to conspire against Luke terrified him. He thought about how many times he had been silent, how many times he had chosen the easiest way to avoid conflict. The doubt turned into a distressing internal dialogue. What if I'm just fooling myself? What if this woman is wrong? What if all this doesn't change anything? Each question was a stab at his determination. He felt torn between the desire to do what was right and the fear of the consequences it would bring. Edward realized that throughout his career, he had molded himself into a system that often prioritized the appearance of justice over true justice. He found himself reflecting on his own trajectory, questioning his past decisions and what it really meant to be a judge. What was success to him? Was it simply following the rules, or was it having the courage to defy the norms in the name of truth? Meanwhile, Lucas also struggled with his emotions. He and Philip had forged a strong bond, but their friendship was being tested by outside pressure. Felipe, always optimistic, encouraged Lucas to free himself from the shackles of the past. "You are not your pain, Lucas. You are more than that," he said, trying to convey strengths that Lucas could not see in himself. But the boy felt that the shadows of his past were like chains pulling him down. He wanted to believe Felipe's words, but the internal struggle was intense. That evening, after the conversation with the woman, Eduardo decided to meet with Paulo to discuss the implications of the new evidence. As he entered the cafe, he noticed the look of anticipation on his friend's face. "You look different," Paulo said, watching the tension in his eyes. Eduardo took a deep breath and shared the news. The words came out quickly, as if he was finally releasing a burden he had carried for a long time. "A witness. She saw it all." Paul's reaction was immediate, but not without a shadow of skepticism. "This can change everything, Eduardo, but we need to be careful. If we don't handle it well, we can put Lucas in an even more vulnerable position." Paul's words served as a reminder of how delicate the situation was. Eduardo was silent, absorbing the responsibility he was about to assume. The encounter with the woman had lit a flame inside him, but it also left him in a constant state of alert. He realized he couldn't ignore the pressure he was feeling. Every time he looked at Lucas, he saw a reflection of his own insecurities. The boy needed someone who believed in him, someone willing to fight to the end. Eduardo decided that he would be that someone, even if it meant putting himself at risk. However, this decision did not come without an emotional cost. Eduardo was confronted with his own fragility. He was afraid of failing again, of disappointing Lucas and himself. The feeling of helplessness consumed him, and he wondered if he really had what it took to face the system that seemed so impenetrable. He remembered his past mistakes, times when he got carried away with conformity and the search for approval. The memories were painful, but also revealing. What did he really want? What did it mean to succeed in your life? While Eduardo struggled with these questions, Lucas lived his own moment of reflection. He began to understand that while he couldn't change the past, he had the power to shape his future. Philip became her constant support, and together they explored the idea that truth could be a form of liberation. Their friendship blossomed in the midst of adversity, but Lucas still struggled to believe he could overcome his grief. He wanted to be strong, but memories of the tragedy prevented him from seeing a clear path ahead. The conversations became deep and emotional. Felipe challenged Lucas to face his fears, not to let bad experiences define who he was. "You are more than your scars, Lucas. You are a survivor," Felipe said, and those words began to resonate more strongly. Lucas began to understand that true overcoming was not only about winning the external battles, but also the internal ones. Eduardo's encounter with the truth and Lucas's struggle to find himself culminated in a moment of clarity for both of them. Eduardo realized that true justice was not just a matter of rules and procedures, but a commitment to human dignity. He was ready to fight for Lucas, not just as a judge, but as a human being who cared deeply about the boy's life. This new perspective not only strengthened Eduardo's resolve, but also brought a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, but he was willing to brave any obstacle to ensure that Lucas had a chance to break free from his past. And so, both Eduardo and Lucas prepared to confront their truths, willing to stand up and fight for what really mattered. The transformation they were both experiencing propelled them forward towards an uncertain future, but full of possibilities. Edward sat in his office, the shadows of the night enveloping him. The dim light of the lamp illuminated only a small part of the table where papers and notes were scattered. The conversation with the elderly woman still echoed in her mind, but now, along with hope, new doubts arose. He wondered if he really had the strength to stand up to the system he knew so well. The idea that his decisions could affect Lucas's life paralyzed him. He wondered if he was prepared for the consequences of his choice. That morning, Eduardo decided to go to court early. He needed time to organize and reflect. As he walked through the cold corridors, he felt the weight of his colleagues' looks. He realized that from that moment on, nothing would be the same as before. His decision to fight for Lucas could change everyone's perception of him. Which would be more important, the approval of others or the pursuit of truth? As soon as he arrived at his office, Eduardo began to review the documents of Lucas's case. The pages seemed to multiply in front of him, each carrying a fragment of the boy's story. He remembered Lucas's look, full of pain and despair, and felt a lump in his throat. "I can't fail him," thought Edward, as a new impulse of determination grew within him. At the same time, Lucas was at home, surrounded by his memories. Felipe's presence by his side was comforting, but the pressure to overcome the past seemed overwhelming. "If you could change something, what would it be?" Felipe asked, while they were both sitting on the couch. Lucas was silent, pondering the question. Part of him wanted to erase the pain, but another part knew that this would be impossible. "I just wish all this had never happened," Lucas replied, the sadness showing in his voice. Felipe looked into Lucas's eyes and said, "I understand, but that doesn't define who you are. You can use that to become stronger." Philip's words were like a light in the darkness, but Luke still felt lost. He wanted to believe that he could find the necessary strength, but the internal struggle was exhausting. "What if I can't?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "You're not alone, Lucas. I will be by your side, no matter what," Felipe assured, and the words of friendship were a balm for Lucas's soul. However, even with Felipe's support, Lucas still felt suffocated by the memories. He needed to face his demons, but the thought of exposing himself again terrified him. Meanwhile, Eduardo was preparing for the hearing that could change everything. He reviewed his notes, but his mind was full of uncertainty. The idea of introducing the new witness made him nervous. "What if they don't believe me? What if it ends up making Lucas's situation worse?" he thought, his anxiety growing by the second. The weight of responsibility seemed greater than ever. At the hearing, the room was full. Eduardo felt the critical look of his colleagues and the expectation of the defense. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated. The words felt stuck in his throat. But then he remembered Lucas and everything that was at stake. With a deep sigh, Eduardo decided that he could not let himself be carried away by fear. He began to lay out the new evidence, making a point of emphasizing the importance of the witness. The tension in the room was palpable. Eduardo felt the reactions around him. The defense reacted with skepticism, and some of his colleagues viewed him with disapproval. But despite the nervousness, he continued. He realized that he was confronting not only the system, but also his own uncertainties. His voice gained strength as he spoke about the truth and the need for justice. After the audience, Eduardo met with Paul again. Paul's look was one of concern. "You know this can have consequences, don't you?" he asked, trying to assess the situation. "Yes, and I am prepared to face them," replied Eduardo, with renewed determination. He knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was willing to fight for Lucas and himself. Meanwhile, Lucas was anxious to know what had happened at the hearing. Felipe encouraged him not to lose hope. "Eduardo is a good judge. He's going to do what's right," Felipe said, but Lucas still felt insecure. What if all this is in vain? He wondered, anxiety washing over him again. That night, as Eduardo was returning home, he reflected on the journey he had begun. He realized that by seeking the truth for Lucas, he was also blazing his own path of self-knowledge. He needed to learn to deal with his failures and fears, but he also discovered that he could be a force for good. The commitment to truth and justice was becoming his new identity. Lucas, for his part, began to realize that the fight for his freedom was not just an external battle, but an internal journey. He wanted to be more than his scars and pains. He wanted to become a survivor. Their friendship with Felipe deepened, and together they began to dream of a future where pain did not define them. The battle was far from over, but both Edward and Luke were ready to face the consequences of their actions. Hope welled up in their hearts, and the journey of overcoming, although full of uncertainties, promised a future where they could finally find peace. Both were learning that sometimes true strength comes from facing one's fears and fighting for what's right. Eduardo felt the pressure of the moment. The courtroom was full and the air was heavy, as if everyone around him was holding his breath, waiting for his words. He prepared to speak, but uncertainty still haunted him. He remembered Luke's hopeful look, and it encouraged him to keep going. With a deep sigh, he began to lay out the new evidence, his voice trembling at first, but little by little gaining firmness. "It's crucial that the truth comes out," he said, looking directly at the jurors. "Lucas is not just a name in a lawsuit. He's a young man with dreams who deserves a chance to start over." Eduardo realized that he was not only fighting for Lucas, but also freeing himself from his own insecurities. Every word that came out of his mouth was a small victory, a step towards his own overcoming. During the testimony, Eduardo felt that he was rediscovering himself. He remembered his failures, the moments when he hesitated to stand up for what he believed in. But now, every mistake seemed like a lesson, every stumble an opportunity for growth. He began to see the value in his journey, realizing that his experiences made him stronger and more human. After the hearing, he met Paulo in the hallway. "You really stood out, Eduardo, but are you sure you're ready for the consequences?" asked Paulo with a worried look. Eduardo smiled, a genuine smile that reflected the new confidence he had found. "Yes, I'm ready. I know this can change everything, but I can't go back. I have to do what's right." Meanwhile, Lucas was at home, anxious. Felipe noticed his friend's restlessness and decided to start a conversation. "What are you thinking, Lucas?" "It seems far away," he said, sitting next to him on the couch. Lucas hesitated, but Felipe's presence was comforting. I'm afraid that all this will come to nothing." "What if Eduardo fails?" he asked, the insecurity showing in his voice. Felipe looked into Lucas's eyes, looking for the right words. "What if it works? You've overcome so much. Every day is a new chance to change your future. You have to believe in yourself, just like I believe in you." Lucas felt a warmth in his chest with his friend's words. He began to realize that he was not alone in this struggle. Philip's support was a reminder that even in the darkest hours, there was light. As the days passed, Lucas began to explore his emotions. He knew he needed to face his fears, but that didn't mean he had to do it all at once. He decided that he would take small steps. He began to write in a diary, recording his thoughts and feelings. Each page filled was a way to express herself, a way to transform pain into something more productive. One night, while writing, Lucas recalled a moment of his childhood that marked him. He had lost a swimming competition and felt defeated, but instead of giving up, he decided to train harder and come back stronger. It was there that he realized that his flaws do not define him. They were part of his journey. He smiled as he remembered how he had overcome that challenge, and for the first time, he felt that he could do the same now. Eduardo, in his office, reflected on his own failures. He remembered the fear that had paralyzed him on other occasions, the hesitation that had prevented him from acting. But now, seeing Luke fighting for his truth, he decided that he could no longer let himself be overcome by fear. He began to see the value in his past experiences, not as a burden, but as a foundation for a better future. Sometimes you have to fall to learn how to get up, Eduardo thought as he reviewed his documents. He had learned to value not only victories, but also defeats. Each mistake was a lesson that helped him build a stronger version of himself. Over time, the friendship between Lucas and Felipe grew even stronger. They began to support each other in their struggles. One afternoon, Felipe suggested that they take a walk in the park. As they walked, Felipe talked about how nature always calmed him down and how important it was to find moments of peace in the midst of chaos. "Sometimes we just need to stop and breathe, Lucas," Felipe said, looking up at the clear sky. Lucas began to understand that life was not only about challenges, but also about simple moments of joy. He allowed himself to smile, enjoying every step they took together. The journey turned into a time of reflection and growth. Lucas realized that he was beginning to break free from the chains of his past. He was no longer just a survivor, he was becoming a fighter. Felipe's support was the strength he needed to keep going. Eduardo, in turn, was preparing for the next hearing. He knew things wouldn't be easy, but there was a new light in his heart. He had found his voice and was determined to use it. The lessons he learned encouraged him to move forward, not just for Luke, but for himself. Their lives were in transformation. Eduardo and Lucas were learning that true overcoming was not just about overcoming challenges, but about knowing themselves, understanding their failures and growing from them. Together, they were ready to face what the future held, with courage, hope, and the certainty that they were not alone. The courtroom was in absolute silence, and the jurors' eyes were fixed on Eduardo, who, even in the face of immense pressure, felt that he had reached a decisive point. He took a deep breath, trying to control the anxiety that pulsed in his chest. The new evidence he had presented seemed small, but to him, it meant the difference between Luke's freedom and condemnation. These documents clearly show that Lucas was not where they claimed he was on the day of the crime, Eduardo said, his voice beginning to gain volume and confidence. He was at a community meeting with witnesses willing to confirm this. The accusation was based on assumptions and not on facts. As he spoke, Eduardo could feel the weight of Lucas's gaze locked on his face. The young man was sitting in the front row, his expression tense, but his eyes shone with hope. Eduardo knew that any slip now could cost his friend his freedom, and the responsibility that weighed on his shoulders was almost unbearable. The murmurs in the room began to increase. Eduardo noticed the incredulity on the faces of some of the jurors, and doubt began to creep into his mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if people still believed the wrong version of the facts? The fear of failure rose like a threatening shadow. But amid the confusion, he remembered Lucas and his struggle. He couldn't let his own fears paralyze him. "I know many of you may have questions. I've had it too," continued Eduardo, now addressing the judges directly, his tone firm. "But it is in doubt that we must seek the truth. No one should be judged without the opportunity to defend themselves, and Lucas deserves that chance. He is not a criminal. He is a victim of circumstance, just as many of us have been." Eduardo's words echoed, creating a moment of palpable tension in the room. He felt his heart racing, but at the same time, a wave of determination invaded him. He decided he couldn't hesitate any longer. It was time to fight for Lucas and for himself. He was no longer the person who let himself be carried away by fear. He was someone who had learned to get back on his feet. Finally, Eduardo paused and looked at Lucas. The young man now had his eyes full of tears, and Eduardo realized that his fight was not just for Lucas, but for all those who were unjustly accused. He was connecting with something bigger, a cause that transcended his own insecurities. "We all face difficulties. We all have our fears and flaws," said Eduardo, his voice softer now. "But it is the way we deal with these difficulties that defines us. Lucas is not what people say he is. He is a warrior, a survivor. And if we have to make mistakes, let it be because we believe in a person's ability to start over." Eduardo's words seemed to carry a different weight now. He felt that he had touched something deep inside each one there. Luke's gaze was now one of pure gratitude, and this filled him with courage. Eduardo didn't just speak for him, he spoke for everyone who felt lost and hopeless. However, the prosecutor was not willing to let Eduardo's presentation go unanswered. He stood, a scornful smile on his face. What if all this is nothing more than a maneuver to divert attention? What if Lucas really is guilty? Are you willing to risk the life of an innocent in the name of a dream? The room fell silent again. Eduardo felt butterflies in his stomach. He knew that this was a question that could destabilize him. What if Luke really was guilty? What would that say about him? But then he remembered Luke's journal, the pages written with pain and struggle, and how every word there was a testament to the strength he had found. "I'm not risking anyone's life," replied Eduardo, his voice now a rock. "I'm believing that everyone deserves a second chance, and Lucas deserves to know that regardless of what the past has shown, he has the right to be heard and to fight for his future." Eduardo's words reverberated in the room. He felt the energy shift, as if something much bigger was at stake. The prosecutor, realizing that the tide might be turning, tried to strike again, but Eduardo was prepared. He wasn't going to let doubt or fear get the way of him. He had learned that every battle was a chance for growth. Finally, as he looked at Lucas, Eduardo realized that he wasn't just fighting for a friend. He was fighting for all who felt powerless, for those who, like him, faced failure and rose again. And there, in that room, he decided that the only option was to move forward, with or without support. The moment culminated in a palpable tension. The judge intervened, and the room looked like a silent battlefield. Edward, now stronger and more resolute, felt that he was not only defending Lucas, but also himself. He had found his voice and refused to let it be silenced. He knew that regardless of the outcome, he had done what was right. As the hearing drew to a close, Eduardo left the courtroom certain that he had overcome not only Lucas's struggle, but also his own insecurities. He had discovered his inner strength and the ability to fight for what he believed in. Life would continue to bring challenges, but he was ready to face them, one step at a time. And so both Eduardo and Lucas were ready to start over, stronger and more united than ever. Eduardo left the courtroom with a sense of relief and exhaustion, adrenaline still pulsing through his veins. The clamor of the room still echoed in his mind, but now all seemed far away. He had done what he could for Luke, and regardless of the verdict that would come, he knew he had fought with all his might. The sunlight coming in through the window made him feel lighter, as if the shadows that had accompanied him for so long were beginning to dissipate. "You were amazing," Lucas said, standing next to her, a smile that lit up her face. "Really amazing." Eduardo looked at his friend, noticing the mixture of gratitude and hope in his eyes. He was no longer just Lucas's lawyer. Now they were allies, united by a common battle that had transformed them. "I didn't do it just for you," Eduardo replied, his voice firmer than he felt. "I did it for all of us. For everyone who has ever felt like they had no voice." He knew that this fight was not just about absolution, but about dignity and the ability to get back on his feet after the fall. The days that followed were a mixture of anxiety and expectation. Eduardo and Lucas became inseparable, spending hours discussing plans for the future. Lucas talked about his dreams, about how he wanted to help other young people who, like him, faced the weight of unfair accusations. Eduardo, in turn, dedicated himself to understanding more about the legal system, determined to become a defender of the oppressed. He had found a greater purpose in his life, and it filled him with new energy. On that sunny afternoon, as they walked through the park, Lucas stopped and looked at Eduardo. "If it wasn't for you, I'd still be stuck in a story that isn't mine. Thank you for believing in me." The words were simple, but loaded with meaning. Eduardo felt a wave of emotion. He had forgotten how good it felt to feel appreciated. "You are strong, Lucas. You always have been. I just pointed a light to what already existed in you," replied Eduardo, feeling that his own insecurities were dissipating with each moment he spent with his friend. Their friendship had become a pillar of support, a safe space where they could both share their vulnerabilities. The verdict came days later. The room was crowded again, the air charged with tension. Eduardo watched as the judge handed down the sentence. As the word innocent left his lips, a cry of joy echoed in the room. Lucas was surrounded by friends and family, tears of relief streaming down his face. Eduardo stood in a corner, smiling with his heart full. He had helped rewrite Luke's story, but more importantly, he had rewritten his own. With Lucas's freedom, both began to plan for the future. They founded a small non-profit organization dedicated to helping young people facing similar hardships. Eduardo realized that true success was not just about winning a case or winning a title, but about making a difference in people's lives. He had learned that a person's worth lies not in material possessions, but in their actions and the way they connect with others. As he reflected on his journey, Eduardo understood that life was not a straight line. There were ups and downs, failures and new beginnings. He had made mistakes, but each of them had taught him something valuable. Through pain and struggle, he had found his voice, and now he was ready to use it. The lessons he learned along the way began to manifest in his daily actions. He became a more attentive listener, a more empathetic person. The connection with Lucas transformed him, and he found himself more willing to help others, to offer support without expecting anything in return. Their friendship was proof that even in the darkest situations, light could be found. As the months passed, Eduardo and Lucas saw the organization grow. They held lectures in schools, promoted community events, and helped clarify the rights of young people. Their impact was visible, and each time someone shared how their lives had changed, Eduardo felt like he had found his place in the world. The journey of overcoming did not end when the verdict was handed down. It was a constant learning, a search for understanding and connection. Eduardo realized that by helping others start over, he was also reinventing himself. Edward had observed the transformation that had taken place in his life since the day he defended Lucas in court. Looking back, he remembered his insecurities and the doubt that permeated his career. Before, he fought not only against the injustices of the world, but also against the limitations that he himself imposed on himself. Now, the fight for his friend had been the spark that lit a flame within him, a flame that propelled him to become a stronger, more confident version of himself. He was learning to accept his flaws, to value his achievements, and to understand that life is a tapestry made of experiences where every thread, every color has its value. And so together, Eduardo and Lucas continued to walk, not only as a lawyer and client, but as friends, as brothers in struggle, with a bright future ahead of them. Life offered them new opportunities, and they were ready to embrace them one day at a time. As time passed, Eduardo realized that his experiences had shaped him in ways he could never have imagined. Not only did he become a more competent lawyer, but he also became a more empathetic and understanding person. Lucas's journey intertwined with his own, creating a bond that taught him about resilience and the importance of fighting for others. He remembered Luke's words when he had thanked him for believing in him. That gratitude resonated in his heart, reminding him of the impact a single action can have on someone's life. With the organization they founded together, Eduardo found himself in a new role, that of mentor. He began working with young people who, like Lucas, faced difficulties and uncertainties. Eduardo listened to them, offered advice, and shared his own stories of failures and new beginnings. He learned that often the act of listening was as powerful as any legal argument he could present in a court of law. By doing so, he not only helped others, but also healed himself. Every story he heard, every tear he wiped away, was a step toward his own inner peace. The new perspective that Eduardo had acquired also led him to reflect on the concept of success. He realized that he had previously measured his success in terms of awards and recognition. Now he understood that true success manifested itself in the changes he could bring about in people's lives. The letters he received from young people thanking him for his help, the lives he saw transformed, all of this had become more valuable than any medal he could win. He had rediscovered what really mattered: human connection and the ability to inspire others to overcome their difficulties. During an event at a school, while speaking to a group of young people, Eduardo paused and looked at the expectant faces before him. He reflected on how far he had come. The words that came out of his mouth were now loaded with wisdom and experience. He talked about the importance of learning from mistakes, getting up after a fall, and never losing hope. He knew that each of them faced their own battles, but he was sure that they could overcome them. His heart was filled with pride as he realized that he was using his experiences to light the way for others. The lessons Eduardo had learned throughout his journey became an intrinsic part of his life. He began to practice gratitude daily, acknowledging the small victories and the moments of joy. Life taught him to value relationships, to appreciate the little things, and to understand that every challenge was an opportunity for growth. He continued to get involved in community projects, always looking for ways to give back and make a difference. The friendship with Lucas deepened. They became not only partners in a cause, but true brothers. Lucas often reminded Eduardo of how it all began and how their struggle had shaped them. Together, they celebrated victories, but also learned to deal with defeats. Every step they took together was a testament to the power of friendship and the strength that comes when coming together for a greater purpose. Years have passed since the verdict that changed their lives. Edward looked to the future with a renewed sense of hope and determination. He knew that life would present new challenges, but he was prepared. He had learned the importance of accepting failures and using each one as a springboard for a new beginning. He was no longer the same man who had entered that courtroom. Now he was someone who knew that true wealth was in the experiences he had, the connections he made, and the lives he touched. Finally, Eduardo found peace in the scars he carried. Each one of them told a story, each one symbolized a lesson learned. He had become a beacon for others, showing that even in the darkest situations, light could be found. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and hope, he continued his journey, always willing to help those in need, always remembering that life is a rich tapestry, woven with love, friendship, and overcoming. Eduardo observed once again the trajectory that had led him there. In each step, in each challenge faced, he realized how much he had transformed. The man who once felt trapped in his insecurities was now a respected lawyer, a passionate mentor, and most of all, a true friend. He looked at Lucas beside him, smiling, and felt a wave of gratitude. That friendship, born in the midst of chaos, had become the driving force of his life. "Do you remember when it all started?" asked Lucas with a nostalgic expression. "That day in court seemed so terrifying. I didn't know if I could get through all that." Eduardo smiled, remembering the fear he had felt. "Yes, it was a decisive moment, but you taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it." Eduardo's words echoed in the minds of both. They had learned the importance of facing adversity together. Each challenge they overcame strengthened their friendship, and each defeat turned into a valuable lesson. Eduardo realized that these experiences not only shaped his career, but also enriched his soul. Each day, he reminded himself of what it really meant to be successful. It wasn't the awards or the recognition that mattered, but the lives he had touched along the way. He saw young people who, in a moment of desperation, found hope in his words. He saw changes not only in his students, but also in himself. The gratitude he felt for every smile, for every look of hope, was what really moved him. During an event celebrating the organization's achievements, Eduardo took the stage. He looked at the audience full of young, hopeful faces. "Today we celebrate not only our victories, but also our struggles," he began, his voice steady. "Each of you has a story, and every story is important. Do not forget that the falls we face are opportunities to rise stronger. Learn from them." The words resonated in the room, and as he spoke, Eduardo realized that his journey was not just about him or Lucas, but about everyone who passed through their lives. He saw a young man in the audience wiping away tears, and the connection he felt was instantaneous. "Remember, you are not alone. We are all on this journey together, and each of us can make a difference." At the end of the event, many young people approached to share their stories. Edward listened attentively, offering words of encouragement and consolation. He understood that sometimes all one needs is a listening ear and an open heart. By listening to the struggles and achievements of others, Eduardo also felt stronger. As time went by, Eduardo and Lucas continued to work side by side, always ready to face new challenges. And at each step, Eduardo remembered the lessons learned. He understood that failures were just stepping stones to success, and that true wealth lay in the connections he formed. He also learned that friendship is a fundamental pillar in any journey. One day, while walking through the park, Lucas commented, "Look how everything has changed. Look at what we have been able to build together." Eduardo nodded. "Yes, and this is just the beginning. Each of us has the power to impact the world. Our stories are what connect us and make us strong." Eduardo's journey was not only about overcoming obstacles, but also about accepting that life is a series of new beginnings. He realized that each challenge brought a new opportunity for growth, and that true happiness lay in sharing that journey with others. Finally, Eduardo looked at the horizon and smiled. He had found peace in his path, and more importantly, he had found purpose. Life, with all its nuances, was a rich tapestry made of love, friendship, and overcoming. And he was prepared for whatever came next, carrying with him the lessons of the past and the hope of the future. Now we invite you to reflect on your own journey. What challenges have you overcome? What lessons did you learn? Share your experiences in the comments and join us in this conversation. Let's inspire each other to keep fighting and never lose hope. If you like this story, like, subscribe, and help us spread this message of overcoming and friendship. Together we can make a difference.